We claim to be in the forefront of the fight for democracy and freedom and free markets and self-determination. But in reality, we are the most repressive force in the Middle East region, and the people in the Middle East know this. By maintaining the kinds of divisions and the kinds of conflicts, regional conflicts in the region, who has benefited the most by this? America is a corporate state with a huge military industry. Who is the largest salesman of arms to the Middle East? Of course, it's the United States. Who is the largest provider of training to the militaries of the Middle East? Of course, it's the United States. Who are the militaries of the Middle East really preparing against? They were never preparing to fight Israel. If so, they would have been able to defeat Israel. Israel is 3.5 million Jews. The Arab world is 22 countries and 200 million people. Their armies are used to fight against their own people. The purpose of the armies in the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, in the Saudi kingdom of Saudi Arabia, in the Ba'athist-run Syria and the Ba'athist-run Iraq, for that matter. The purpose of these armies is to keep in power the various client regimes that were originally set up by, in most cases, if not all cases, by the British, and then sort of taken over as clients by the Americans. Now, a veneer of democracy is sometimes placed over to give the impression, when arguments of this kind are raised, that, well, these people are on the way to democracy, but, you know, they don't have any traditions of this kind, and we have to sort of teach them how to do it, and it's taking a long time. Well, all of that is a fig leaf at best and hypocrisy at worst. Take the case of Egypt. Egypt had a revolution. It threw out its king in the 50s. A military government came to power. That military government then led to a civilian government. But who has always headed the civilian government? It's always been a former general from the army who was dressed up in a suit and trotted out, usually in front of Western cameras, to make speeches. And they go through the pretense of elections, but everybody knows who's going to be elected. And the United States says that, you know, this is acceptable democracy and human rights. But if you go to these countries, you find that there's a huge police state apparatus which is controlling each of these countries, and each of these police state, military state apparatuses are trained either in Britain or the United States. Everybody over there knows that. Look at what just happened in Egypt last week. A couple of thousand lawyers, of all people, lawyers, were demonstrating on the streets because another lawyer had been taken into custody and beaten to death by the security services of the government of Egypt. Well, this has been going on for a long time, but it usually doesn't happen to journalists or lawyers or, you know, nice people like that. It usually happens to people who don't have any means of defending themselves other than to attack using terrorism. In this case, the government of Egypt was so weak that it wouldn't even let the lawyers protest on the street. It beat and gassed the lawyers. Why did it do that? It did that because it wants everyone in Egypt to understand that any form of protest on the streets, no matter who it is by, is not going to be tolerated. The regime is too weak to allow that kind of thing to happen. Saudi Arabia is, you know, it's a family, the Saudi royal family. There are no attributes of democracy of any kind. Same thing in Kuwait, although there is this parliament now, but that was, you know, set up to give a veneer of legitimacy in the wake of the Iraqi invasion. What does this mean for the United States? Well, in the short term, it means economic benefits. It means that, as I said once before, our standard of living is kept artificially high because the prize of the 20th century, oil, huge amounts of oil to run our industrial society, is made available to the United States in huge quantities at artificially low prices. That greases our society, but there's another aspect to it, that once large amounts of money had been transferred to these societies for the cheap oil, there were petrodollar reserves. Now, where do these petrodollar reserves go? They don't go to building the infrastructure of modern societies. They don't go for building the Arab world and setting up new institutions and setting up, for instance, an aircraft industry to compete with our aircraft industry. They're as large a society, more than 200 million as we are. Instead, these amounts are recycled back to American corporate banks, and then these amounts are used to purchase the supply of things that many people in those societies don't think they need. They don't need another round of huge military equipment. They don't need, right, take Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia already has a very modern Boeing Saudia Airlines. They don't need to purchase huge amounts of the very latest, unless, of course, they're being encouraged to do so as a political financial trade-off for our having come to their defense and prevented the region, first from being swept away by the tide of Islamic fundamentalism that everyone was afraid of after the Iranian Revolution, and then by the secular Ba'athist power of Iraq, which the real goal of Saddam was not really Kuwait, which we Americans, by the way, had encouraged him to think he'd be able to take over without our opposition. My own supposition, we have no way of proving this to anyone's satisfaction, my own supposition is that the Israelis and the Americans played Saddam for the fool, creating the very conditions by which he decided to go into Kuwait. And it wasn't just a matter of saying to him, we probably aren't going to do anything about it. In the years before the invasion of Kuwait, the United States had encouraged Kuwait to pursue oil and economic policies which were extremely antagonistic to Iraq. If you go back and examine the history of the years before, you'll see all kinds of oil policies, financial policies, oil supply policies, petrodollar policies, which harmed Iraqi interests, and in which Iraq had said publicly that what is taking place now is harming the national interests of Iraq. Well, when the United States makes statements like, it's harming the national interests of the United States, we know what happens. There are invasions of Grenada, and there are invasions of Panama, and now maybe there'll be an invasion of Haiti. And then, of course, there was the harm to the national interests, so that we invaded Saudi Arabia and then attacked Iraq. We apparently don't believe that other countries are entitled to have legitimate national interests of their own. The same thing when it comes to Israel and nuclear weapons. We helped Israel develop its nuclear weapons. We, the United States, created the arms race in the Middle East. Now we say to the Arabs, to the Pakistanis, to the North Koreans, that you're not allowed to have nuclear weapons because the international community has decided, of course, we run the international community on the whole, and if we don't like what they do, we don't pay our bills at the UN. But look at it from an Arab point of view. Why should an Arab say, we 200 million Arabs are not allowed to have modern weapons, which are the token, the currency of power and influence, but your ally Israel, 3.5 million Jews, which works closely with you, they are allowed to have these weapons and to intimidate us with them. Now, from that point of view, it does look a little incongruous, and it certainly is. The benefits to the United States are thus considerable in terms of economic and financial incentives. But there's another price to be paid, and that's the price of growing hatred and growing feelings of American hypocrisy. Let me just tell another little personal story, and maybe these personal stories are key to someone like myself coming here and being interviewed like this. Egypt. About 6-7 years ago, I knew a young man about my age he's a businessman, PhD from MIT. engaged in computerization in Egypt. In fact, that's the context in which I knew him, since I know something about this as well. One day, we'd known each other a week or two, he suggests we go off and have a drink. All right. He chooses a hotel downtown, one of the older classic hotels. We sit down. He's a modern guy, coat and tie. We order some drinks, alcoholic drinks. He's not a fundamentalist. And he says, would you mind if we didn't talk about computers and things today? I would prefer if we talked about my country and what's happening here. And I said, I'm relieved, you've made my day. And without any further to do, I guess this was his way of testing and shocking me at this point. He said, look, do you realize how much hatred exists in my country for your country? I said, I probably don't realize it to the extent that you do, but yes, I do realize it, and yes, that's why I don't think the policies being pursued by my country in the long run are going to be good for U.S.-Arab relations. Anyway, you don't expect that to come from someone of that kind. And he wouldn't have said that to a visiting person who was being hosted by the U.S. Arab Chamber of Commerce, and he wouldn't have said that to somebody at the American Embassy. That was his way of establishing his own dignity, of establishing his own independence, of having a dialogue with, I hope, someone he'd come to respect about what's really happening in the infrastructure to Egypt, because he knew at that time that it looks good on the surface. There are more roads and the phones work better and things like that, but underneath there's this real tension. And that tension has led to the last couple years of extreme violence in Egypt, which is hardly over. I think we're just sort of in the early phases of it. The end of the Cold War is the backdrop for the way things are taking place in the Middle East today. The weak Arabs, the divided Arabs, when there was a bipolar world, could use the Soviets to play off against the Americans. Nasser tried it in the 50s. He said to the West, you're not going to build the Aswan Dam? I'm going to the Soviets. Sure enough, the Soviets built the Aswan Dam. He said, you're not going to arm the Egyptian army? We're going to go to the Soviets. And sure enough, that's what took place in that phase of history. At this phase in history, there only is one military superpower. The Russians love to come to the ceremonies and love to pretend that they're still a superpower, but, they know the reality of the situation. They do not have the liberty to go very far in opposition to what the United States is planning to do. Plus, for the Soviets, oil was never really a problem for them. They are the second largest producer of oil now, and up until their own demise, were the first largest producer of oil. So to a certain extent, the Middle East doesn't represent the same economic interest to them as it represents to us, although it does represent strategic interests that they've always been interested in. The Europeans are a somewhat different case. History has reversed itself. It was the Europeans that created the client regimes, the Europeans that drew the boundaries that don't make a lot of sense in the region, the Europeans that established the system of infiltrating those societies and figuring out how to manipulate their leaders and work with their armies and work with their intelligence services. And if you go back to World War II, you'll find that it was Roosevelt and Churchill primarily, that at the same time they were allies fighting against the Germans and fighting to win World War II. They were both maneuvering under the table for who would have the economic and strategic interests in the vital Middle East region. Roosevelt didn't go to meet with Ibn Saud on the ship toward the end of the war because he needed to make another trip and go somewhere. He was already a very ill man. He went because the American corporate state was already very much interested in not only the oil resources of the region, but in the potential sales to the region. The British wanted to maintain their hold on the Middle East, but their empire was exhausted. So after World War II, what happened? Essentially, the Americans came in And it came to a head in the Suez Crisis. In 1956, the British and the French, losing control over the region, connived with the Israelis to attack Egypt. The ruse was that the Egyptians had taken over the Suez Canal. The reality was they were very upset with Nasser, very upset with what Egypt had become, very upset with the Arab nationalism, and they wanted to show that, we're still in charge here. It was Eisenhower that forced the British and the French and the Israelis to retreat. And in the process of doing that, it became the symbol of, we Americans now call the shots even more than you do. You shouldn't have made this war without our permission. And since it's not quite in keeping with our interests, we're telling you to get out. All right. They got out. The Israelis were forced out of Sinai at that time. The British and the French were told to take their military and go back to where they came from. And Egypt was left in control of the Suez Canal. But the legacy, in a sense, then reversed European-American involvement. The Americans became the dominant player in the region. The Europeans became the secondary player. Economic interests didn't totally go to the United States. The British and the French and the Japanese still have some interests there, considerable interests. But America became the dominant player, plus one other huge factor. The Europeans have been busy with their own integration into their own community. They're building their own competitive economic framework to that of the United States and to that of NAFTA and to that of the American empire, if you will. It's conducted in terms of economic competition, not military competition. Our societies have evolved to the point where it's pretty unthinkable to go to military conflict with each other. But day to day, we're involved in economic conflict with each other. And it sometimes gets pretty brutal. There are threats between the US and France of this kind of embargo and this kind of action. It's pretty dicey at times. But the Europeans have enough to worry about with their own community at this point so that they're not really challenging the American hold over the Middle East region. How this will evolve in the future, hard to say. There's lots of forces working in Europe. Plus, you've still got other economic challenges coming from Asia. But for the foreseeable future, I think the United States will remain relatively unchallenged as the dominant superpower that has control over the Middle East. And the challenges will come from inside Arab societies rather than from other Western societies. The very day of the Cairo Agreement, and I was asked that morning by Canadian National Television to come down to their studio, and on the way down, I was reading the New York Times. And amidst all the articles about how important this is and what a breakthrough it is, and of course I was already thinking what was I going to say, and I was going to say this is an agreement that's been prepared for a very long time, and it's in keeping with what the Israelis have wanted to do with the Palestinians. It's not quite this unprecedented breakthrough that it's being portrayed as. But I looked at the front page of the New York Times and I said to myself, my God, there's the truth of this. There's no story, there's no analysis, it's all in the picture. And there's this huge picture of the electrified fence that's being used, that's being built and completed all around Gaza, right as the Palestinian police are about to enter. Well, that tells the story. The Israelis were letting Palestinians out of their prisons, sending them to the Gaza prison. But the Gaza prison was going to be a living prison. It wasn't going to be a prison with internal barbed wire and cells, and they would have to bring the food in and take care of the prisoners. The Gaza prison, after having destroyed the economy of Gaza, after having beat these people into submission for more than a generation, was now going to be symbolized by this electrified fence. Only those Palestinians cooperative with the Israelis, with their new computerized ID cards and everything, were going to be let out of this prison. The rest were going to be bottled up inside it. And Jericho is somewhat irrelevant. Jericho is 25 square miles they've been given authority over, and it's really, they let the Palestinian PLO have Jericho because Arafat couldn't set up shop in Gaza. The PLO has minority support in Gaza. So he needed an administrative area which was quiet and small and could be policed and roped off and secured from the rest of his own people. And that's why Jericho wasn't really included in this deal. Now the goal, as I said, is to turn over Palestinian population centers to the PLO if on their probationary period they can prove satisfactorily that they can control their own people on behalf of the new arrangement that's been made. I think they're going to have a terribly difficult time doing that, because at the same time that the Palestinian people were beaten into submission, and I mean literally beaten into submission, I'm not just talking about figuratively, I'm talking about every single family in occupied Palestine has had a father, a brother, a son imprisoned, tortured, broken, in many cases killed. People will think I'm exaggerating, but I am simply not. I've been there, I've seen it. Every family has been broken and subjugated in this way. The young generation of Palestinians that made the Intifada are very well aware that they did not fight to be turned into Red Indians in reservations, or to be given autonomy under Israeli sovereignty, or for that matter, to be given a Palestinian police force that was going to police them with Israeli jeeps and joint patrols following after them. I think their fight for their own independence and their own sovereignty is a very important fight, that we should be as sensitive to their needs for security and independence as we are to those of others who have better propaganda here in our country. And I think there's also an issue, whether we're Jewish or Christian or Muslim, that we should reopen. And here, of course, the Jewish community doesn't like to hear these things said, especially by American Jews. In my case, I guess I haven't mentioned it, I represented the World Jewish Congress in Washington for 7 or 8 years, worked for the American Jewish Congress. I don't have to make excuses for my own Jewish credentials and credibility, or at least I don't feel I have to. We should reopen the whole issue of partition. Palestine, the Holy Land, is a country. It has different peoples living in it, claiming different rights and claiming different historical legitimacy. We shouldn't be talking about roping one people off behind an electrified fence here, and border posts here, and checkpoints here, and this group killing this group and retreating into this area. We should be rethinking how it's possible that all the peoples who live there should live in peace and democracy with individual rights. We should be saying, for instance, if one man, one vote in South Africa, if blacks and whites are coming together to live in South Africa and we are all applauding, if we in our own country take such pride in having a homogeneous political society, even though we have distinct groups with different claims within that society, why are we then applauding the total separation of peoples in the Middle East? Why are we applauding and paying for the building of electrified fences? Why are we so pleased about agreements that have a Jewish settlement here, a Palestinian town here, and a Prime Minister of Israel who says we want to totally separate ourselves from each other? That's not the way it was before 1948. It's not the way that it was before the League of Nations and the UN got involved. It seems to me that what we're doing is sowing the seeds, as we did in the Balkans years ago, for more conflict and more pain and heartache in the future. And what we're doing is not consistent with our values either. Our values are secular societies built upon democratic principles. And then, when our Western leaders say to us that we have to oppose fundamentalist Islam in the Middle East because these forces look to religion as the basis of their society, well, where is the first theocratic state in modern times that was built upon a religious test? It's the state of Israel. It's the state which the United States and world Jewry brought to the Middle East and then differentiated between who was Jewish and who was Muslim and who was Christian. We are the ones who brought those concepts to the modern Middle East. And in that context, it's a bit incongruous and certainly hypocritical for us then to say that Jews are entitled to their national entity, but Muslims, who happen to be 95% of the people of this territory, are not entitled to talk about politics and religion in the same breath.